thank you again for joining us this evening. Stay safe and be well. And now over to you, Rob.
Hello.
Rob, good evening.
Hello.
What an experience.
Hi, Henry.
In the virtual world rather than in the Dell or in the stadium in Copthall.
Yes, it's extraordinary. Sadly, the gremlins have come into mind, so I can barely hear you, but it was still such a gift to be able to watch it all with the miracle of modern technology, to be able to share with one another and commemorate.
And to participate. And we were very fortunate to have the messages that we did, the ones before the formal event began, from our religious leaders and from the mayors of Manchester and Birmingham and of London, and then to have the Prince of Wales give the speech that he did was really, really, really heartwarming. I don't know how many.
It really was. It was such a profound thing for you to have.
But I hope that they will all have felt as emotionally affected and uplifted as I have been this evening.
Me too. Henry, I'm afraid to say I can't hear you, but I got something of what you said about how moving it was to have the future king speak so movingly and in such solidarity with us all, and how we ended not just in hope, but with our young people, the next generation, pledging not just to keep the memory alive, but reminding us all that we are all collectively imbued with a responsibility to remember the credo at the center of faith of all of our communities, of every background, to teach our children and our children's children. And that's a responsibility that's not just us, but the rest of the world. And we take it on their behalf.
Well, Rob, you carry a flame for your grandparents. I know you've had a sad loss recently, and I know how involved you always have been all your life with the boys. I carry a flame for almost every member of my late father's family who were murdered in the Shoah. He was lucky. He arrived here on the 4th of August 1939 with a work permit. Saved his life. But apart from one sister and a niece who was born to a sister-in-law in Theresienstadt, the rest of his very large family were murdered. So you and I both have a duty to pass on the lessons to future generations and to make sure that those lives are never, ever forgotten. And you're about to interview a wonderful lady, a fantastic survivor who spends so much of her life talking to people about her experiences and trying to teach the important lessons. And so I'm now going to hand over to you. I hope Mala is going to come online any moment. I leave all the technical thing to the wonderful backroom boys, but thank you for being here with us, and thank you for what you're about to do.
And Henry, thank you for all you do.
Pleasure. Be well.
Oh. I'm here.
Mala, we meet again this evening.
Yes.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
I'm afraid I can't hear you at all.
Oh dear.
So if we pause for a second, I'm going to ask StreamYard if there's something that they can do to improve our sound. I'll pause for a second if that's okay.
I can see and hear you.
Hello? Perhaps someone's listening, the gremlins, who knows? Well, I'm going to press on anyway. Mala, you people will perhaps have had the gift, as I say, and the privilege as well to have met you before, but there'll be many people who don't know you and haven't had the rich chance to get to hear your story. Sadly, as we did earlier, I had yet again the chance to be enveloped in the magic and the moving tapestry of your narrative, but we don't have all the time in the world. So I'm just going to do a quick trot through some of your life. You were born, Malacevic, in 1930, on the 24th of September, in the same town as my grandfather, Pietrkov Chibonelsky. And you're a middle child of three. Of course, you had your older brother, very famously, Seben Helfgott, and a younger sister, Louisa. And for 5.5 years, you survive in the ghetto. And I use the word survive, but we'll perhaps come back to what that means, that word. You were a hidden child, eventually a slave laborer, and in November 1944, you were transferred to Ravensbrück concentration camp, and then ultimately to Bergen-Belsen, where you were liberated. You ultimately ended up in Sweden, as I think we'll talk about, to rehabilitate. And there, much later, you married your husband, and you showed the world your victory, having gone from darkness to simcha. But I'm going to take you back to the beginning. Sometimes in our need to remember, the importance of remembering the Holocaust, we forget about the richness of Jewish life we lost in the first place. Mala, can you talk about Jewish life in Pietrkov Chebonelsky when you were a child?
It was a very happy life, a very vibrant community. We had someone who turned out to be a very famous chief rabbi of Israel. We had other very, important and interesting personalities in the town. Well, I was one of three children. You mentioned my brother Ben and my sister Lucia. I was in the middle child. And life was really lovely. We were 6 cousins all together in Piotrków. There were 4 Helfgott and 2 Klein cousins. And we were just a very, the whole town was so very much alive. I always think about it when I go back there, and I'm always pleased to go back because I like to sort of think of my parents and reminisce and walk in their footsteps and think about them. And there's no better place than Piotrków for that. But somehow the town's lost something. It's lost the vibrance, the sort of happiness that was there for me anyway. So it's very different now, but it was a very, very happy pre-war life. Are you there? Well, I could go on talking about my life, but Robert, I can't do it without you. I want you to ask me questions. Well, perhaps just to fill in time, I'll tell you that that very happy life came to a very abrupt stop on the 1st of September 1939, when war broke out and everything changed. Ours was the first town to have a ghetto. So within 2 months of the beginning of the war, by the 1st of November 1939, we had already been forced out of our homes and into ghetto walls. And sort of life changed completely. But Robert, I wonder what happened to you. Where are you? I wonder how many people are watching this and me asking this question. Well, ghetto life was, as is very well known, as I could go in. We were actually a population, the Jewish population of Piotrków was 15,000 out of a total population of 55,000. But during the war, the ghetto at its height had 28,000 people in it. And you may wonder why. And that's because the quite a large chunk all around that border was immediately annexed. It became part of Germany, part of the German Reich. And of course, all the Jews had, and the influx, what the Jews had to leave, that had to be made what they called Judenreich, Rhine, free of Jews. And they, lots of them came into our ghetto. Gosh, am I pleased to see you, Robert?
Oh, I'm
Go
pleased to see
on,
you
ask
back.
me a question.
I think we can hear each other finally.
Yeah.
Now, I could just get the edge of what you were talking about in early life and the richness of Jewish life in Piotrków. I think what people don't necessarily know is just how quickly things went from being safe to being unsafe. It's right to say that after the invasion of Poland, Piotrków was the first Jewish ghetto. Am I right?
Yes, it was the first ghetto in Poland. Yes, ours was the first, and it started within 2 months of the war. So we were there quite a long time. But it wasn't the worst ghetto, but it was the first ghetto. I mean, some ghettos became terrible places, and ours was bad enough, but it wasn't the worst.
Now, one of the interesting things, Mala, is that for a lot of the time you were together with your family, and at first your experience was that you, as the Germans came and the threat of the deportations loomed, there was an arrangement that was made between you and a Gentile family for you to go and stay there with another young person. You were there for a while.
Yes.
Until I think 1942, when you ended up going back to the ghetto.
Yes.
And you ended up in the arms of your parents. But can you say very briefly what happened to the other girl who you were hiding with?
Well, it was my cousin Ija, and the ghetto, there was going to be a deportation, and we knew that children were going to be deported to their deaths. Most of the population, except for a small number of people, well, small, about 2,000 out of 28,000. They did have jobs, so they were reasonably safe as one could be in those days. No one was ever safe, in actual fact. But my parents made arrangements for me to live as a Christian away from the ghetto during the deportation. Anything to avoid the deportations, because we knew where they were going. It was going to be a place like Sobibor, Majdanek, Treblinka. Those were death camps. People were sent there just to die. And, well, the gas chambers and so on. And in order to avoid that, some people managed to make arrangements, and my father, together with my aunt and uncle, my parents and Ida's parents, were recommended to a man who was not only Christian, and he was prepared to hide 2 Jewish girls for the duration of the deportations and then return them. But he was actually of German origin, and therefore he enjoyed a lot of privileges that others didn't, and we were going to be even safer with him. And for that reason, of course, it was dearer as well. This was an expensive business to sort of pay to be saved. And it all happened. We went by train. We stayed with those people, but we were very vulnerable and very homesick. And my cousin, who was an only child, she couldn't bear it. She wanted to be taken back.
Now, Mala, I think it's true that you ended up coming back to the ghetto, and whereas you made it back, there was a mystery as to what happened to your cousin who did not. And to this day,
Yeah.
we don't know what happened to her.
Yeah, it's because she couldn't stand it. They agreed to take her back to friends who she said were hiding her parents' valuables, and they would take her in. And we learned, well, eventually when the time came, he took her back. The time came for me to go back. The deportations were finished. And when we arrived at the flour mill where my father now worked before the war, it belonged to him and his partners. When we arrived there was my father waiting for me, but also my uncle, Joseph Klein. He said he went white with shock. And he said, "Where's my daughter?" And he said he took her back to these good friends. But in fact, nobody knows what happened to Ija. He apparently did arrive at these good friends with Ija. They collected a suitcase full of valuables. He left with Ija and the suitcase. And that's the end of the story.
Now, there are so many elements to the story, one which you told me earlier and has stayed with me. You know, one of the gifts of speaking to a survivor is something new emerges and you're cloaked in a new memory, which always changes you. Earlier on, you, of course, talked about coming back to the ghetto and your father and Ben back then had work permits, but you were illegal. And they came, of course, to take your mum and your younger sister, Lucia, and you away. And there was a book which you may recall by the late, great Primo Levi called Moments of Reprieve. And you had a moment of reprieve at that time. What happened when they came to take you away on that day?
Well, there was a room full of people. We were illegal. I happened to be in bed. I wasn't ill, but I stayed in bed. So it was rather crowded, and the bed was free. I hopped onto it, and my mother said that I wasn't well. And the policeman in charge, Jewish policeman, said that's all right. She can stay. He took everybody else away, and I was left there. Now the people that he took away, and they were sort of searching and taking other people, they kept them in a kind of prison, which was actually this great synagogue under terrible conditions. And then they took them out on the 20th of December 1942. They had to walk at dawn to a place called Rakov, a forest, a local forest. And there they were murdered in the most horrific way. We know what happened because witnesses came to tell us, but it's something I never repeat, but it's all very well documented. There were the killings in the forest that were taking place at that time.
And I think, I'm not sure if you were, we went together with Sir Ben and my late grandfather to make a mitzvah there, to have a place of memorial in the forest. And there is one now. Moving forward, Mala, there was a second moment of reprieve for you. You were to be taken away. At this point, you were in sole care of a 5-year-old cousin whose mum had been removed from her, physically taken away. As she screamed, "Look after my child." You think at that time were probably around 12 or 13 years old, and you became the carer of your 5-year-old cousin. And as they put you in the line to deportation to, at that point, who knows where, you decided to do something, a story you told me earlier, which I'm still shocked and moved by. Can you just tell us again
Yeah.
what you did?
Well, when the ghetto was being liquidated, there were just two sets of workers for two labor camps. And there were still some illegals. Well, the people that they had collected earlier, but they hadn't got them all, and they came back for more. And they were searching, got all of us out, those that they found, they got out outside for deportation. So we were standing outside in a sort of long column. Lorries were arriving and loading people up on at the front of this column. I was towards the back. It was all very scary, and they were standing there with their rifles, and if anybody moved, they'd shoot. But I looked to my right, and I saw a German officer who was obviously in charge of this deportation, but he wasn't doing anything. I had plenty of helpers. He was just watching. And I don't know what gave me the idea, but I stepped out of line. I went up to him and said that I've been separated from my father and brother. They're inside the ghetto. Would I go back to them? And he was absolutely flabbergasted. He sort of looked at me curiously. He was a little bit amused, a little bit surprised. I don't know what was in his mind, but he actually called over a Jewish policeman and said, "Take her back inside the ghetto." Now,
You went back and I'm going to, sadly, we're running out of time.
Oh,
which is such a pity. You told me earlier how you walked back to that ghetto and you insisted upon taking your 5-year-old cousin. And there you were, her protectress throughout the war. Now, later on, at that point, you ended up in Bulgai, which was a wood factory with your parents, well, your father at that point, excuse me, and your brother. And you were there for a while until you were separated. You still with this 5-year-old who you were caring for, a 13-year-old child. And first you stopped in Ravensbrück, the well-known infamous female concentration camp, there for a while. And you told me that you thought that that was the beginning of the end of hell, except it wasn't, because from there you were taken to Belsen. And of course, there have been programs in the last week talking about the impact of the liberation of Belsen, what it felt like, what it was. When you arrived, can you describe the scene when you first arrived?
Well, when we arrived, they didn't have any room for us. It was so overcrowded. And they put us up in a tent outside the camp. In the morning, they took us in. And the scene that met us it's really indescribable. You can't really convey the full force of what you saw. So the first thing that hit you was a smog and a smell. And there were people there, but there were skeletons, and they were sort of shuffling along aimlessly like zombies. They would shuffle along and just collapse and die. So there were dead bodies everywhere. There were piles of bodies and piles of naked, twisted, decaying bodies. It was just a horrific, horrific scene.
Mala, a young child, when you were liberated in 1945, at that moment, can you describe that feeling of knowing you were free?
You know, I actually was in the middle of having typhus. Not in the middle, I was at the end. I was well enough to see. I was actually in bed. No, not we didn't have beds. I was on my upper bunk by the window. And I must have come out of unconsciousness, and I saw people running, and I didn't know why they were running or where they were running. All I could think of was, how have they got the strength to run? Because typhus is a terrible, terrible illness. It saps you of all energy. You're just lying there almost dead. So that was the liberation for me. I was ill, and I was there still for another couple of days before I was collected by, two soldiers came with a stretcher. And you know what I said to them? I don't need the stretcher. I will walk. But I promptly collapsed.
There's an expression for that, which I always experience and think of when I meet survivors, Dovka, to be contrary, that you don't get power or control over my story. On that note, having been liberated from Belsen and everything that you've been through and your family, do you have a message for young people and perhaps the world? Is it a message of hope or despair? Perhaps more important than ever now?
Yes, I do a lot of, I speak to a lot of schools, and I always like to leave them with a message, because they're young, perhaps they'll see the light. And so the first thing I say is that, why do I speak? Well, that's what they ask. Is it difficult to speak? And I said, yes, it is. And therefore, why do I do it if it is? But, well, I can control my emotion. That's one thing. But the other thing is, I think that it is very important for the young people to learn from the Holocaust. There's a lot to learn from it. And the first and foremost thing is, how to treat life, how to treat other people, and how not to be a bystander, how to stand up to prejudice and discrimination. And when you see injustice, act. Don't just stand by, because this is, the Holocaust demonstrates what happens when a society breaks down and a despot is allowed to rule, and that there is there is this terrible prejudice that leads ultimately to death.
Mala, I think I'm sure that I speak for everybody, that having been through unimaginable adversity, you've chosen to live a life of hope and positivity and optimism. And hearing you gives us all energy and a sense of something so needed now. So thank you so much for speaking to us, for teaching us, and for your extraordinary spirit. Next time, Baruch Hashem, we'll be together, touching one another in each other's presence, and we can hear more of your story. Thank you so much, Mala. Bless you.